Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the next episode of the Physique Decoded. We are very, very lucky today to have Dr. Mike Israetel on the show. So welcome, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So for those that don't know yet, Dr. Mike is coming to Perth to run a seminar on the 15th of October. The last seminar that we had with Mike here was absolutely incredible. Smashed all attendance numbers. The information was invaluable. We're going to be super excited to having him come back this year again on the 15th of October. Do you want to give a brief rundown of what we can expect from the Dr. Mike seminar on hypertrophy on the 15th of October?
Absolutely. First of all, I'm super excited. I'm super thankful. And as far as I know, there's only one resource I go to when I'm reaching out to Perth, and that's you and your gym and your team. So I'm super honored to be there. But so October 15th, it's going to be a seminar about troubleshooting your muscle growth training plan. For example, I'm not getting pumps. What am I doing wrong? I'm not getting sore. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Am I doing something wrong? My joints are hurting, like in some exercises, or maybe kind of all the time, or just in some movements. Maybe, another problem that people run into pretty often is they kind of have all the really well set plan, and then they overreach early, and they're not able to hit the performance targets they want. They start hitting muscle groups, go to failure. They get really fatigued. What is there to do about that? And a few other topics. It's basically like some pretty common problems people run into with their hypertrophy training. And I'm really excited to give the talk because it's very easy to make YouTube videos. Like if I do it, and I do it all the time, it must be easy, but telling you how training should go in kind of an ideal sense, like this is going to happen, then that. But what about when things don't go well? And a lot of that's not really addressed. And what else I'm doing here is not just talking about troubleshooting, but it's going to be a longer seminar. The talk's going to take a little while longer than most talks because I'm going to try to be pretty interactive about it. And I'm going to just try to solicit problems that folks who go to the seminar are having. And there'll be a distinct time for me to talk and do my talk. But then after, there's going to be a very extensive Q&A where I'd love to hear from everyone about like what are the problems they're experiencing in the muscle growth plan, and can I help them with some hints as to how maybe they can resolve them. Now, full transparency, some of the stuff that people say, I might just be like, I have no idea what the hell's going on. Sorry, it's out of my expert area. But some of the stuff I may be able to get some hints, and some of the stuff we may be able to just solve right on the spot. So, and because we're all in a big room together, hopefully maybe something like 50 or more people at the same time, it's going to be a really great thing because sometimes people riff off each other, or sometimes somebody asks a question that you may not even have thought of, but you're like, God damn, that's a really good question. I actually have gotten into that situation myself in my training, and I really wonder how it's going to be solved. So we're all going to put our heads together and try to come up with solutions. I think many of the folks that are going to be attending already kind of have the basics pretty well down, or at least they're busy training hard and making good gains. And they just have some of these issues that we all run into. And I've run into all these issues before. I've run into them with tons of clients, tons of other folks, with myself, and I think I might be able to help. So it'd be a kind of a cool seminar to go to. We're also pricing it pretty cheap, no $1,000 an hour tickets or anything like that. And if you want to come down, now listen, I will try all of my worst jokes, and at the very least, I'll be so not funny that you can laugh at how not funny I am. And at the best, I'll even have a couple of wisecracks that people can giggle at. So it'll be a good time. And I'm really pumped for it.
Yeah, it's always an entertaining seminar when you come out, and it's cool that you had said that on the Q&A, because I remember the last time that we had you guys out, when we had the whole team out, and the Q&A actually went off. I mean, like, we had so many people asking questions on so many different realms, and like you said, people bounced off, and it was, this person had a similar issue, but it was slightly different, so they would bring up that question, and it ended up being really extensive. Like, I think we ended up actually doing the Q&A a whole lot longer than we planned, but that was a really good part where a lot of people got a lot of good information out. So I'm excited for that one, and I know everybody else will be too. So we're super glad to have you coming out in October.
I love it.
The topic today that we wanted to go through was reps in reserve. So Reps in Reserve was, and I'm going to say created, popularized by yourself. You were the very first person. I had never heard of it before until I had started delving into the RP stuff a little bit more. We at Physique get a lot of questions on Reps in Reserve and on intensity. So I thought it would be really cool today if we could get explanations from the boss man himself on Reps in Reserve. So just jumping straight into it, what is Reps in Reserve?
Great question. And I got to give a hat tip to Eric Helms and his team at 3DMJ. I think I did a lot of the heavy lifting on popularizing the concept in the lifting community. And I think their team did a lot of that. And also they publish quite a bit of formal literature on it and sort of defining it and doing a lot of the studies. And it's really just been a collaborative effort worldwide. And it's also like people have been doing Reps in Reserve for a long time. They might have not called it that. They might have called it, reps from failure, which is what we used to call it. But actually leads right into my definition for it. Reps in Reserve is how many reps, be technical, how many reps you have left until muscular failure occurs. That's the top line definition. But there's more under the surface. There's a bigger iceberg under the water. Because what is failure? And here we can be more specific. Reps in Reserve is how many reps you can do until you fail with good technique. Because especially in exercises that are amenable to cheating, it's really tough to define what failure is. I mean, bicep curls, right? Like if you start swinging around a little bit, shit, you got 3, 4, 5 extra reps. But reps of what? Certainly not a curl, because then it's like a full body kind of situation. So if we say, okay, we're never going to let our technique break down, so long as technique doesn't break down, at some point, the weight just stops moving and your concentric phase ends before the range of motion has been completed. That's failure. And then Reps in Reserve is how many reps you have if you finish a set. Before that happens, how many reps could you have gotten before failure actually occurred? And that second part is really interesting because Reps in Reserve is almost always an estimate because it's reps you think you have in reserve. Because if we go all the way, let's say we put your 10 rep max on the bar, you do 10 reps, grind it, basically you can't do any more reps, you rack the weight. How many reps in reserve is that? Well, 0, because you couldn't have done another rep. But like, okay, so 0 reps in reserve is the only thing that exists? Well, no, we could have done 7 reps. Okay, cool. And then it's 3 reps in reserve. You could have done rep 8, rep 9, and rep 10, 3 reps in reserve, and then that would have been it. But what does that mean, could have? How do we know you could have gotten 10? There's a bit of mystery there. So inherent in the concept of reps in reserve is always some multiplier of error based on estimation. Like you may, could have gotten 3, but maybe gun to your head, you could have gotten 4, maybe no gun to your head that day, you could have gotten 2. So reps in reserve is kind of almost always a guess, but as we'll, I'm sure, talk about in a little bit, it is a very valuable concept that even though it's a guess, it can be a very educated guess that can provide you with a lot of utility in your training.
Okay. And what, if we're looking in terms of reps in reserve, how is this going to be important in regards to hypertrophy? So we've got,
yeah,
go on.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, in terms of, if we have a client looking at maximizing hypertrophy, what does reps in reserve mean to that person? How are they going to be using it? Why is it so important?
Yeah, so we can start out with, that's a very good question. We can start out with just an idea of, okay, why do we care about reps in reserve at all? And that's a very good question. We could choose not to care about it. Choosing not to care about it puts us into essentially sort of one of 2 conditions, and we can talk about each of them and their upsides and downsides. Condition number 1 is we just train to failure every single work set. After the warm-up, every single work set's trained to failure. You go as hard as we can. That means we don't need to concern ourselves at all with reps in reserve, but that could pose some problems for us. Now, I can actually just talk about some of these problems right now, and we can extrapolate later about what they could be. The thing is, because you are training every set to failure to not have to deal with the reps in reserve concept, to try to avoid it, you're essentially sort of buying the entire landscape the entire situation that occurs with training to failure, which means you get some good stuff. For example, every set is hard. Certainly nobody can accuse you of not training hard enough set for set for set. But the other thing you're buying is potentially some of the downsides, like a lot of fatigue. I mean, training to failure fucking burns you up. I mean, it just destroys you. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a bad thing, but it's definitely partially bad, because ideally in training, you could just train, walk right through it. No fatigue, you could keep going, you'd be a machine, you get gains forever. So if we just go to failure all the time, we get some good stuff, get some bad stuff, we can avoid the reps and reserve concept altogether. The other way to avoid the reps and reserve concept altogether is just like do a certain number of reps that you know you can do. You won't go to failure, and just do straight sets with certain upper under. So for example, you'll see this in routines where people say, squat 3 sets of 10. And that's all it says in the program. And it used to, when I was a master's student, a graduate student, I used to see programs like this. And I'm a very systematizing type of person. I want very concretely defined conditions, so I'm not left in an air of mystery to make my own shitty decision. I have almost no natural intuition at all. So if you leave something blank, I'm like, I have no idea what to do here. Who knows? My guess is probably going to be wrong. And so I'd see these programs that say, squats 3 by 10. All right. How hard are those sets of 10? I mean, like, if we just say, okay, we don't care about a reps and reserve, we don't even want to concern ourselves with the concept. Let's say I can squat 400 pounds for one set of 10 to failure. And it says squats 3 by 10 on the program. Is that 380 pounds? Is that 200 pounds? Is that 5 pounds? But 5 doesn't seem like the right answer. 200 also seems too easy. But is it 315? Is it 290? That seems pretty tough. Is it 360? That seems really tough. Is it 390? That seems almost impossible to do 3 sets of 10. So if you don't use the reps and reserve concept, you're either married to 1, training to failure all the time, or 2, training in question mark city all the time. And you don't even know if you're training hard enough, because you could just be like mailing in the reps, so to speak. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 rack. And someone's like, what? What are they going to ask? You're like, well, how many did you have left? That's the inevitable question of how hard was that set? How many reps did you have left over? And if you don't ever concern yourself with reps and reserve, you will never be able to answer that question. And thus there is a certain precision with which you will never be able to construct your training around.
So when we're looking at bodybuilders, we're looking at hypertrophy enthusiasts training, what would be the estimated reps and reserve ranges that you would consider training hard enough to elicit muscle hypertrophy?
Sure. Just real quick, I'm going to steal that. I'm going to borrow that term from you. And when I'm on the flight to Australia, I'm going to be sitting next to someone, and they're going to be like, so what's your deal? What are you doing here in Australia? I'll be like, well, I'm a hypertrophy enthusiast. They're going to be like, what? And be like, oh, bodybuilder. Sorry, that term doesn't.
It's the less competitive way to say it, I think.
Yes, 100%. It's very accurate. Because, bodybuilder entails a lot. Like, a lot of people are just trying to get jacked. They're not trying to step on stage half naked, covered in oil. They can't tell if that's a bad dream I'm having or if I've actually done that for competition. Yes, that's right.
And my other thing with that as well, right, is, powerlifters are trying to get bigger too.
Yes.
There's a lot of, I work with a lot of basketball players that need to get physically bigger and stronger too. So technically
all athletes,
bodybuilders as well.
Yes.
So
yes, hypertrophy enthusiasts.
A little bit more specific. Yeah.
Yes. So the research on this is getting pretty rich. And the theory on it is very interesting too. But generally speaking, in beginners, this question is a little bit of a different answer, because beginners have such a low threshold for what constitutes a robust overload to promote hypertrophy. They can train 5, 6, 7, 8 repetitions in reserve and still get really good gains. Like, if you take a beginner's 10 rep max and have them do sets of 4 with it, they're going to get great gains because they're beginners, and kind of like lifting a pencil makes you grow muscle at that point. So it doesn't really matter. But for folks that are getting into a few years of training now, and the gains are still coming along great, but they're not so easy, I'd say it's a good bet of something like 3 or 4 reps in reserve and harder, and fewer reps in reserve. So if it's your 10 rep max in the bar, a set of 6, 7, 8 reps plus, so 8, 9, 10 for sure reps, that is going to cause very robust hypertrophy. And at that point, I suppose the next logical question, I don't want to preempt you, is, okay, so if we know that the range, let's just call it 3 reps for convenience, 3 reps in reserve and less, those 3 reps, 2 reps, 1 rep, 0 reps in reserve, anything above 3 reps in reserve causes robust hypertrophy, causes great results to happen. I don't want to preempt you, but the next question people often have is, okay, but is there like a difference between that? Because look, if someone says, like, here's your 10 rep max, get results. Wouldn't it be great if like just doing sets of 7 gave you the same results as sets of 10? I mean, geez, it's a whole lot easier. Like, why crush yourself if you could just do fewer reps? So there's a whole fruitful discussion. It's a little bit more nuanced and technical to have about where in that range from 7 to 10 is good. Or if you're doing sets of 20, 16 or 17 reps, all the way to 20 reps, that range is. So I'll say this, for those of you interested in a simple answer, anything with 3 reps in reserve to 2 to 1 to 0 is just a big green check mark. So you're good to go. If you're training hard in the gym and things are going well, as long as you're 3 or 4 reps in reserve away or less, you're golden. But there is another technical discussion about, well, where within that is the best idea.
Okay. Now, this is a question, this is going to be an offset question of the one that I had, but this is also just me being selfish and wanting to know this. In terms of progressing using reps in reserve, do we look at hypertrophy in the way of a linear progression of we need to progressively overload week to week, or are we looking at progressions over time? And how does reps in reserve come into that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in general, I think it really pays to zoom out with a lot of these concepts and just talk about in general, what is it we're after? Like, if you're talking about, like, if someone's like, this is mildly politically correct potentially, but if someone's like, so trying to set, you'll say single and they're trying to set you up on dates, and they go, what kind of girls are you into? And you could zoom out and say, well, first of all, generally attractive girls, they don't want to be like, well, black hair and this kind of face and that, and then some kind of like zombie shows up and you're like, I guess technically they meet all my characteristics. Like, there's something missing, right? Yeah. So I'm going to for sure get canceled for that. But in any case, the big picture for hypertrophy and overload and progression is you just want to make things a little bit harder over time. Why? Because the same stimulus over and over, your body tends to get used to it. And then it won't really marshal the resources of your muscles to grow any bigger. Systems adapt to challenges. When you're sufficiently challenged, then you improve. Like, if you're taking a French, for example, and you're doing 2nd grade French, at some point you can speak like a 2nd grader speaks French, but no more. And no more 2nd grade French is really going to make you that much better. You start learning 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade French, and then you'll get much, much better. But it's harder for sure. You have conjugating and all sorts of crazy stuff. I'm actually proficient in the French language, but this is only because I went to culinary school in France in the 1940s. It's a rare fact about me. But, so at some point you have to say, okay, we're just trying to make things harder over time for sure. And to be technical, the how and the specifics of how you make things harder, not nearly as important as making things harder. But if you want to make things harder over time, a way to do it is to go through the reps in reserve spectrum. But before I describe that, I have to lay the foundation of why we're going through that spectrum at all. So just a quick thought exercise. We know a couple of things from research and theory. One is that training at, let's say, 4 reps in reserve or 3 reps in reserve works pretty well. But if you get stronger and bigger, what used to be 3 or 4 reps in reserve gets easier, right? Like, like bench the same weight multiple weeks in a row, it gets easier. And then what used to be 3 or 4 reps in reserve starts to backslide to being 5 or 6 reps in reserve. And we already know from earlier points that we made that 5 or 6 reps in reserve may not grow a whole lot of muscle. So we don't want that sort of thing to happen. So if we say we're only ever going to train at 3 or 4 reps in reserve and never harder, we have to worry about constantly training just a little too easy. It's like people that want to leave to drive to work with their work starts in 10 minutes and they leave exactly 10 minutes before work, like one little traffic jam and you're not getting to work on time. one little adaptation by your muscles, and all of a sudden your reps are, 4 or 5 reps in reserve, and you're not getting great muscle growth anymore. So we're not interested in doing that. So we say, okay, shit, we got to go hard. We can't go too easy. How about we just start our program, not at 3 or 4 reps in reserve, but start our program and just go to failure all the time. Failure, every week failure. Because we can still progress like that. You can train to failure every single time and still add 5 pounds to the bar, or add a repetition here and there, and you still have this progressive overload, right? The problem with training to failure all the time, especially as a more advanced athlete, is the amount of stimulus you get is very, very good. From, let's say, training 3 or 4 reps from failure, the stimulus is here. Training to failure, we have more or less every reason to believe that the stimulus is here. It's higher. It's more stimulus by, let's just call it 10% or something like that. The problem with training every set, multiple sets in a program, week on week to failure, is that while the stimulus for the failure condition is a little bit higher, the fatigue is much higher. I mean, much, 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 much higher. Way more than 10%, call it 50, call it 70% higher. And this is something that people can experience for themselves. It's not just science make-believe in the gym. Like we're like, oh yeah, research has found a computer will beep, boop, beep, boop, and then somehow it says train to failure cause high fatigue. I mean, if you grind leg presses and hack squats and dumbbell presses all the way to failure, it takes something from you that, to quote a friend of mine, that you never really get back, at least not for multiple weeks of deloading or something like that. The fatigue quickly accumulates, and one of those is probably some physiological reasons, but there's also psychological reasons, because if all of us that really like to train, we have to do something in our brains and our minds that means we're pushing as hard as we can, which train to failure really is. I mean, it starts to be an emotional thing where you got to get up for that shit, and it taxes you like crazy. And that's great for one session. Monday, legs, fuck it up, failure, everything amazing, great growth too. Next Monday, you're a little tired. The Monday after that, you may start to get weaker because your underlying adaptations are going like this, but your fatigue is going like that, skyrocketing. And then it turns out your fatigue just outpaces you, and it's just an unsustainable situation, right? They used to have, Russians used to have a fighter called the MiG-25 that was the fastest interceptor of its kind, except Western intelligence agencies later found out that every time it went its maximum speed, it burned its engines out completely and had to have them replaced. Like, that's not a very effective warfighting machine, because one flight, then it's just done. Right? You don't have spare parts, the whole thing is over. So it's just not a sustainable way to do things. So we think, okay, here's the landscape. 3 or 4 reps in reserve all the time. Risky because we could err on the side of easy and then just not get the great gains. Failure all the time, awesome, except the fatigue problem is just way too much. So to roundabout long way to get to your question, I know your viewers are super sharp people, so I got to do this whole science bullshit. I can't just speak in generalities. Yeah. So how do we solve this problem? Well, what we can do is start the program at something like 3 or 4 reps in reserve. But every time I show up to the gym, every week, we either put 2.5 kilos on the bar, or add a repetition, make it a little bit harder every single time. And not in an auto-regulatory way, not like, oh, I'm feeling good today, I'm going to add more. Just every time a little bit more, like steady progress. And what that does is, on average, the first week is going to be 3 or 4 reps in reserve. Week 2 is going to be 2 to 3 reps in reserve. Week 3, 1 to 2 reps. Week 4, 1 to 0. Now, if you're making great gains under the hood, you can actually buy yourself a few extra weeks of, you essentially repeat the same RIR, because even though you put 5 pounds on the bar, you got so much stronger in that week, so much bigger, that your body's like, whatever, fuck it. This is still 2 reps in reserve. I don't care, right? Amazing. That would be amazing. But we know that unless you become the strongest human being that's ever lived, and every weight you lift is the same reps in reserve, eventually the shit will catch up to you. Bench 150 kilos, then 152.5, 155 on the week, 157.5, 160, reach 162.5. You're going to be much closer to failure at the very least, even if you're making the gains of your life. At some point, you reach failure on one of your weeks. And at that point, the fatigue has been climbing so much, because not only are we doing lots of volume every week, and that fatigue climbs by itself anyway, we're also doing lots of volume in a way that we're doing every session's much harder, because it's closer to failure each time. And so the fatigue isn't, if we started just at failure week one, the fatigue would go, just go right up and that's it. We last maybe 2.5 weeks, then we'd have to shut down and deload. Here, maybe we last 4 to 6 weeks. But at the end of that process, because we're training so hard, because we're so close to failure, it's unsustainable. And then we have to deload. But check out what we got as a result. We got a sweet progression. We worked through the whole reps in reserve range. We made sure we didn't hang out in that low zone too much. We made sure that we didn't hang out in the super crazy to failure zone too much. We worked through that whole range, and we can basically say that the average reps in reserve we did was like 2 for the whole program. But we got the easy gains at the beginning, because like if someone says, look, you get great gains doing 3 reps and 4 reps in reserve, why in God's name would you start a program at 2 reps in reserve? What the hell, are you allergic to easy gains? Like, if someone says like, hey, there's this like really cheap burrito you can buy here, I'll buy the more expensive one. Like, what the hell's wrong with you? It's great. Everyone says it's great. Come on, right? So you get the easy gains first. You get that great momentum from adding, and you have a lot of room to grow because you start at some reps in reserve 3 or 4. You have a lot of additions of weight or reps to make, lots of weeks of great progress before you're unable to continue. And you also get super close or actually get to failure in the last week of your program, last 2 weeks. And what that does is it check marks the idea that like, hey, you're training as hard as fucking possible, at least on occasion. And it also does a really great thing for us. A common question that I get quite often is, look, if we know that there's an exponential fatigue problem with going to failure, why the hell are we going to failure even in the end of a program? Why don't we just stop at 1 rep in reserve? And that brings us back to the start of this conversation, where we said that every rep in reserve estimate is just an estimate. You don't really know until you push it. So if you once a mesocycle at the very end before you deload, go really close to failure, at least enough to understand that, look, the next rep's not happening for sure. It doesn't mean you have to go to failure and drop the bar on yourself. But that rep at the end where you do this, you're like, someone's like, how many reps in reserve was that? You're like, dude, how many do you fucking think? Get out of my face. Of course it was 0. But if you go to that point regularly, once a mesocycle, 1 is you get to check mark the idea that like, okay, I went hard. But 2, arguably at least as important, maybe more so, is you get to really shit test your estimate of 3 or 4 reps in reserve. Because let's say you're squatting 100 kilos in your first week, and you're like, yeah, I did sets of about 10 reps, and I say that's 3 reps in reserve. So you'd be like, okay, so 100 kilos, you could maybe squat for what you're saying is like 13 or 14 reps, gun to your head. You're like, yeah, that's what I think. Let's say you work up, and you're trained, you're well trained, you're not like getting newbie gains anymore. Let's say you work up to 110 kilos at the end of the cycle, and then you go for your all-out failure sets in the last week, and you get 18 repetitions with 110 kilos. Now, look, neural adaptations are what they are, but assuming this isn't your first time squatting, how the fuck did you get 5 extra reps out of the fucking hat? And the answer is your initial estimate of 3 RIR or 4 RIR instead of 10 at 100 was just wrong. You were sandbagging. You weren't trying. So next time it's time to put weight on the squat after you deload and start the new mesocycle, someone can say, hey, what'd you do last time in week 1? Yeah, I did 100 for sets of 10. I got to tell you, I know that's bullshit. As it turns out, when I tried my hardest, I was actually a lot stronger. So I'm going to go at 110 kilos, but I'm going to do sets at 12, because if I did 110 for 10s, I know it would be too easy. And that can be a really awesome feedback. It allows you every single mesocycle, by going very close to or to failure, you can really shit test yourself. Now that shit test works the other way around too, where you think something's 3 reps in reserve, you get to the failure week and you like get even fewer reps than you thought you would. And you're like, looks like that first week really was 1 rep in reserve, like I thought it might be. And I'm sure you look at client videos in your job, and sometimes clients send you week 1 and they're like 3 reps in reserve, and their last rep is like, ugh, and you're like, man, what are you talking about? You're lucky if that's 1 rep in reserve. So that whole system of progressing through the rep in reserve is not like just because we like reps in reserve or there's some kind of artistic cool thing to progress through it. At every step of that process, there's a logical reason. Get the easy gains first that we know we've got coming. But also because you're doing some new exercises, your technique is much easier to set in line versus like week 1, go to failure. Because we know like new technique, when you ask someone to go to failure, that technique is likely to break down towards the end. And we don't want that sort of thing. So we check that box of easy gains at the beginning. We check the box of a really solid progression. And we check the box of we go fucking hard at the end. And that also allows us to shit test the whole thing so that every single new mesocycle we do would become better and better and better at judging failure, judging reps in reserve, and making sure that our entire mesocycle is in that quality 3 or 4 to 0 rep reserve range. And there's actually direct research to back up. Surprise, that well-trained lifters judge their reps in reserve way, way better than untrained lifters, with whom it's a crapshoot. That's the Eric Helms study I'm referring to. I think they had a person who like thought they were going to do 10 reps, but ended up doing like 22 reps. Like that person should not be allowed to train by themselves. Like, no. I want to watch you do these reps. But you know, trained lifters usually were off by 1 or 2 reps in their prediction, which, hey, we're in business. You know, that's good stuff.
I always find it interesting as well. Towards the end of, we have a thing called a subscription training, which is like a group training section for hypertrophy that we use at Physique. And every week we put the reps in reserve in, and generally in the final sort of week or 2 of the blocks, I may have, you know, the 4 sets, and the first set might be 4 reps in reserve, and I'll lower it getting into the final set. And we may take 1 set to 0 reps in reserve or max. And I always find it really fascinating to read the numbers when people come in and they say, okay, on my first set that was 4 reps in reserve, I did, for example, 100 kilos, and I got 12 reps. And then when they get to the final set, they're still doing 100 kilos, but they got 19. And then for me, that's a way that I can sort of show them as well and say, hey, you know, either form was going out the window a little bit on the final sets, or maybe depth on the leg press wasn't quite there. Or on top of that, maybe you're just hearing 4 reps in reserve and you are being way too reserved. So it's again, like you said, you know, it's a really good feedback method to sort of self-regulate how hard you're actually training.
Yes. And another thing I found is a lot of people, there tends to be a small amount of inter-individual variability on RIR estimates. The non-brainy ass nerd way to put that is people generally tend to make the same kinds of errors for most of their muscle groups. You know, there's kind of, generally speaking, 3 categories of people. People that just don't know any better and they're sandbagging, they don't know. So most of their exercises, they think it's 3 reps in reserve, it's really like 6 or 7. Then there's people who more or less get it correctly with some, you know, error, of course. And then there's the other group that think it's 3 reps in reserve, but it's really like 0. And it's not like, oh, on my bicep curls I can tell, but on my tricep extensions I can't. There's for sure some variability there, but a lot of it comes down to psychology. Some people are just a little bit meek, maybe doubt themselves, or they're technique perfectionists. And as soon as they even have to try to maintain good technique, they're like, oh, that's it. Technique failure, I'm done. And that's not true. But then there's other people that you're like, hey, good technique, show me what 3 reps in reserve looks like. And they're bleeding out of their eyeballs by the end of the set, doing God knows what. You're like, holy shit, do you need psychotherapy? And they're like, that's why I come to the gym. And you're like, I see. All is forgiven. So a lot of times you can tell a lot about a client based on how they deal with the reps in reserve. And then you can coach them. You could say, hey, Susie, listen, you can go a little harder. It's okay to let the beast out. And then you can go, hey, Rob, I understand you had a tough childhood, but let's dial it back a little and focus on technique. And when you think it's 3 reps in reserve, it's really like 0. So when you think it's 5 reps, just stop. And then a lot of times people can learn from their own behavior over time and just become better at hitting the right targets. And then everything gets better after that.
Absolutely. And I also just want to reiterate that point because it's something that I see quite a lot in terms of the reps in reserve is, you know, when people say, oh, just, you know, train to failure, like you were saying. And, you know, anybody that's done that, and we've all done it, like nobody's going to deny that they haven't done that before.
Years.
And done certain things. And, you know, there's only, again, like you said, there's only so long that you can progress things. And, you know, to say, oh, I got 1 extra rep this week, I got 5 extra kilos. And it's like, you know, if that was the case and it worked that well, you know, somebody could start deadlifting 100 kilos the first time they step in the gym and then go up 5 kilos a week. And then, you know, in 3 years time, you know, they're deadlifting 650, 700 kilos, which we know is, you know, sounds crazy. But again, you know, this is just that whole, the reps in reserve model is that whole sustainable progress over time that sort of help self-regulate where you're at and where, you can't do that. And, I think it's a
Yes.
really good model to use that sort of, again, like you said, pulls some people back that, are trying to go to failure every single week, but it also pushes some people forward that are a little bit, iffy on
Yes.
pushing themselves. Absolutely. So that's
100%.
yeah. So I think that was actually a really, really informative, good description of what reps in reserve. And I think a lot of people are going to get a lot out of that. I know this podcast is going to go directly into the client groups as a fantastic reference for people when they ask questions about reps in reserve. So I really, really appreciate you coming on and doing this education on reps in reserve today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. One last thing, if I may, really quick.
Go for it.
We talked about a lot of stuff today, a lot of technical shit. Folks, at the end of the day, just do your best to guess your reps in reserve. Some people just go completely in their own heads, doubting themselves. Am I really going hard enough? Am I going too hard? Just do your best. And if you really want, look at some of your sets on video after and try to get, I got pretty close that time. Remember, if you're struggling a little bit, if the bar is shaking a little bit, if you feel like you're getting close to failure, multiple sets of that will get you muscle growth, no problem at all. And another thing is the IFBB pros, they barely pay attention to reps in reserve at all, and they're monsters. So don't get to thinking like, you'll have to make a lot of mistakes in reps in reserve that are obvious over time to just get really bad gains. So even though there's a lot of technicalities involved, just do your best and you're probably going to do just fine. Yeah, you'll get better over time, but don't second guess yourself, but don't third and fourth guess yourself.
Yeah. I think I remember last time you were in Perth, and when we were having a chat at breakfast one time, we were actually talking about intensity and reps in reserve. And one of the things that you said to me really stuck with me, which is, when the lifting phase of the rep starts slowing down, you're generally starting to hit that sort of 3 to 4 reps in reserve. So that to me has always been a really good indicator that I use with clients is, when the concentric, so if you're doing a bicep curl, when you're lifting it up to your body, or a squat, when you're, coming from the ground and standing up, when that starts slowing down and you're pressing as hard as you can, you're generally starting to get within the range of hypertrophy. Would that be still something that you would consider correct?
Definitely. The only caveat there is some people can do grinders for 8 reps straight. And some people, everything looks the same until they just can't get the rep. And you're like, the hell is wrong with you? You just quit. And no, there's just their fiber type and neural architecture and all this other stuff. But generally speaking, when the weight starts to really feel like it's pushing back at you, good things are happening. And that set you're doing is officially considered hard. And even if you just stop then, you'll probably get some good gains. Push a couple more reps into that and you'll get great gains. I will say this, if you finish an entire set and at no point did it really feel like the weight was pushing back at you, it didn't feel like it was even trying to slow down, 9 times out of 10, you could be going harder.
Yeah, we got some bad news for you.
Right.
Perfect. Okay, so we're going to finish this today. We're going to do something called 5 and 5. So I'm going to fire 5 questions at you. Now, this won't actually, don't believe any of them have anything to do with reps and reserve. So we're going to have 5 questions. You have about 60 seconds or less to answer each one. So really brief answers. So you ready to go?
Am I being judged on the correctness of the question, completeness of thought, or what? What's the metric here? Just
we're just having some fun.
I'm really bad at having fun. Hit me. I'm ready.
Okay. All right. Number 1, what's the biggest wow moment you've had in your fitness career so far? Like the biggest, holy fuck, that's crazy.
I was on a business trip to San Diego a few weeks out from my last bodybuilding show. And I came home and I trained at the home gym and I pulled off my shirt and I did a set of dips well into the workout. And I had all these veins through my abs and I was like, holy shit. Like I just had never seen that before. And it had been a few days since I was in that mirror in that environment. And I was just like, oh, shit just got real as hell. There's like a little bit of a difference between lean and like, holy shit, lean. And I could officially cross that precipice. And I was like, okay, I'm rocking it. And then motivation after that's not an issue because when you're really peeled, all you want to do is get in the gym and just look fucking peeled. So it was really intense. I don't know if it's the biggest wow moment, but it's definitely one of those.
Well, I mean, for bodybuilders and hypertrophy enthusiasts, veins are a very good way to measure progress. Absolutely.
You got the veins. You're well on your way.
Exactly. All right. Second question. Something outside of the gym and the fitness industry that you really love that people might not know about.
Not know about. I'm a huge fan of electronic music, specifically a subgenre called progressive. Most people just think it's noise, or something you would hear in like a very like up-tempo business elevator or something. And they're like, this is stupid. This is like a robot dying or something. But I'm a huge fan. I think a lot of people expect me from lifting to listen to like gangster rap or like metal, which I also do, but like I just love progressive. And if I ever around other people that are into progressive, most of them weigh like one half of what I do and have like different colored hair. So it's kind of a bit of a culture clash, but you know, you don't choose the music you like, it just sings to you at some point.
Is that your lifting playlist?
Yes. Oh, great question. I don't listen to music when I lift almost ever, because it just hypes me up too much.
Right.
And I have more than enough to pay attention to while I'm lifting. But if I really need an extra push, Jared Feather, one of my training partners, him and I have almost we're very similar music tastes, and we'll put on some progressive and just fucking lose it. So yeah, when the time comes, that's the music that gets me going.
Gotcha. Okay. Question 3. Something in the hypertrophy realm that you're really curious to learn more about.
I want to learn more about the direct molecular signals that trigger muscle growth so that potentially pharmaceutical companies can develop drugs that directly target those, or genomic medicine that can directly target those. Because, every time we lift weights and do all these things to our bodies, the only reason we're getting more jacked is just literally the activation of various molecular machines. And if we learn the activation well enough, and first of all, we can tailor training by measuring those activations. We can automatically figure out what kind of training is better than what other kind, because just measure the systems that are getting activated after different kinds of training. So, okay, this is better than that. But also potentially pharmaceutical interventions to just ramp those up anyway, so that you can be like any level of jack that you want just by taking a different number of pills every day. And if they're really specific to those skeletal muscle pathways, they may not even have any side effects. But that would be, if in 15 years we could all retire from fitness because everyone's fit just by taking a magic pill, that'd be pretty sweet. I'd take that retirement pretty well.
I'm about to say we're about to see an 800-pound Mike Israetel.
Yo, that'd be a terrible existence. I was at 250 recently, 250 pounds, and it was already awful. So 800. Mm-hmm.
Imagine that. Jesus. Okay, question 4. What's the most awkward gym moment you've had while training? Embarrassing, awkward. I know you're throwing up in the buckets on Instagram, so this is going to be
that's not embarrassing to me. Like, I haven't actually been embarrassed in years, maybe a decade. I almost forgot what that feels like. It's a very junior high feeling. I will say, I'll give you this answer. Every now and again, when I talk to people at the gym and they're asking me some training stuff or just having a conversation, I'm always careful to keep my answers very general and oftentimes kind of do probing questions, so I don't like offend anyone's predilections about how to train. Because if you're training if you're training around someone that like really loves going to failure and they're super bought in, and they're like, hey, what do you think about training to failure? I've done the answer before, which is a bit awkward of like, it's dumb. And they're just like, and you're like, oh, I didn't mean that. God damn it. So nowadays, you just go, there's some upsides and downsides. And they go, like what? And then you can talk about it more evenly. So a lot of times, just my big mouth gets me in trouble where I say some stupid shit. And, it's just the person just wasn't in agreement. And I never want to alienate anybody. So I just have to shut up more and be kinder, I think.
Absolutely. Understood. Completely understood. Okay. The final question today. What is something in regards to hypertrophy or training that you've done a complete 180 on in your career?
Training to failure. So in my first few years of training, I took every set to concentric failure on everything. The worst I did was squats. I did 0 reps in reserve. Like I get every rep that I thought I could. And I would have this thing where every 3 weeks, my fatigue would exponentially rise so high that on the 4th week or even on the 3rd week, my reps that I was able to do, I only added like 10 pounds to the bar. It would get cut in half. So for example, I would do this thing where I would get like 315 pounds, sets of like roughly 10. Awesome. Next week, 325, sets of 10. Great. Week after that, 335. I remember this distinctly, set of 6. And I was like, is there some kind of weird mechanism there that like as soon as the body detects that other last 5% of weight, it's like, no, cut it off. Well, no, it turns out just my fatigue was going like this. And, I didn't even know what deloading was back then. And I was convinced that training to failure was the best because it was the hardest. And I was done for the challenge. I didn't understand fitness fatigue dynamics. I didn't understand reps in reserve. And I was super, super like, I proselytized people about it. I insisted that anyone who wasn't going to failure was training hard enough. And then nowadays, I'm very much in a more nuanced position, but in some sense, the opposite of that position. And it's kind of crazy. I remember some of the things I literally told my friends and training partners are, in retrospect, highly embarrassing because they're just, well, fucking wrong. So, yeah.
I think that's a good thing, though. I think, somebody had once told me that if you can't look back on what you were doing 6 months ago and pick apart mistakes, you're not getting better.
Yeah.
So
or you were flawless.
Yeah. So
which is unlikely.
That's a good thing. And it's if you look at things from 5 years ago and you say, yep, that was perfect, you probably haven't gotten better.
Yeah.
You haven't gotten smarter, haven't gotten more educated.
Sure.
I think that's about it today. I think we've run through, we've gotten answers to every single question that we had. Other than that, we are going to be super excited for you to make the trip from Michigan out to Perth on the 15th. And we're going to have a bucket ton of fun. One thing that I will say to everybody as well with the Mike Israetel seminars is you're not going to get Mike coming in and it's not going to be all textbook, could read it out of a book information. Mike is fucking hilarious when he presents. He gives a great mix of storytelling, analogies, making fun of people, making fun of himself. It's always a good laugh, and it's a very entertaining way to learn, and you do get so much out of the seminars. And I know the last one people still talk about that you were here, and that was 3 years ago, pre-COVID, 3.5 years ago, and there's still
pre-COVID, man.
Yeah, crazy, the before times. And there's still people that are talking about that, or talking about the recovery methods that Dr. Hoffman said, or going through exercise selection, which you went through, and things like that. So we are super, super excited for you to be coming out. And again, thank you for coming on the podcast today and having a good chat with us. I know you're busy.
Awesome, dude. Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to the Perth seminar. Look, worst case, it's just going to be really pathetic, and you're going to think, I thought this guy was funny. It'll just be really sad. And you can laugh with your friends about me afterwards. Like, that guy really just took a downhill turn. But best case, it'll be really funny and educational, and everyone will have a good time. So
they both sound like a win to me.
It always.
It always is. All right. Thank you so much for being on the show, Mike. And we'll see you on the 15th of October at the Physique Code.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can't wait.